It's safe to say these days that we effectively have what might be called a soft tyranny emanating from what people typically would describe as the left, or people that politically align themselves in that direction. And I honestly don't believe in these absolute binaries, but it's a useful descriptive tool, even if at times it's somewhat inaccurate. And when I use the term soft tyranny, I actually mean it, which is to say, we're not suffering under the heel of an actual tyrant or a group of tyrants that are punishing us with the threat of execution or physical torture. But by soft tyranny, I mean that if we say certain things that are not approved of, or we think certain things and give voice to those thoughts, that we will subsequently, at times at least, receive punishment. Sometimes people's livelihoods can even be threatened simply for having a different view or a different opinion. And we've seen this on the internet, we've seen this in the public discourse, etc., etc. And so, soft tyranny of the left, I don't know if that's an entirely accurate term. Obviously, people who feel themselves to be on the left or align themselves with the left would disagree with that. But I'm actually in this video not particularly concerned with these political polarities. It just so happens that in today's day and age, the people who seem to be most reactive in a negative way to thoughts and speech that they disagree with, these people tend to be on the left. And sometimes I engage in a kind of thought exercise, going back to the past, wondering about potential scenarios. For example, if 10 years ago, when Barbarossa first got started, if he had encountered various obstacles to his freedom of expression, if he would have gotten the word out. If other people who have subsequently enriched my life or spread information that I found useful and interesting, if they too would have been silenced. And this really describes the fulcrum of the discussion in this video. There's this term, of course, the hill that you would die on, which is, of course, synonymous with the place that you draw a line in the sand, the place you're not willing to offer compromise anymore. And in this spirit, I want to talk about the importance of freedom of speech. Now, of course, now when I say freedom of speech, it sounds incredibly hackneyed and overdone and over talked about. You'll get the likes of Dave Rubin ranting about classical liberalism and how important free speech is and blah, 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 and so on and so forth. But in this video, I want to offer an alternative perspective. But before I do that, I want to talk about why I don't think this issue really does have a political polarity to it. And before I offer as listening the following clip, I'd like to preface it with the following. Now, what you're about to listen to is discussion that was being had by various people on the alt-right. They're not representative of everyone on the alt-right. The gentleman in question's name is Morgoth. He blogs, and he has a small YouTube channel. And I have nothing against him personally, although I wouldn't say vehemently, but largely disagree with his assessment of the world. But nonetheless, it's illustrative, what you're about to listen to, of why this is not an issue of left or right politics and why freedom of expression is important, which I'll get to in a bit after we listen to this clip.
That for me, that's just how the world operates. It's why I don't believe in. I'm not an absolutist on free speech. I think the arguments that people have on free speech now, it's just completely from our side. It's just pragmatic. It's just, well, we need it because we're in the weaker position. But I'm not going to lionize free speech the way a classic liberal does, just for the sake of having free speech, because I think there's some things beyond that, and it's worth using power to get them. Of course, we're on the receiving end of that power. The classic liberal assumes there is no overarching power imposing itself on the world, and everybody's an individual operating within systems. But it's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense.
I made a video about this, that if you have free speech, you get subversion as well. So you have to pick one or the other ultimately. And what you need an ultimate moral arbiter just to make arbitrary decisions and draw the line at where free speech is okay and where subversion has to be stopped.
I mean, again, I can't speak for all of the alt-right or whatever you've seen, but within the sort of philosophy of nationalism, It's taken for granted that those with power will use it to suppress those who don't have power. We're not egalitarian. And so it's no surprise to us that the people with power are suppressing us. That's just part of the course. That's just the way the world works. That was exactly how Hitler saw the world. All you have to do is make sure you're the one imposing your will on the world. But we're not liberals. There is that we have to support liberal. This is where you get into a sort of paradox, because then we do have to sort of play the liberal game to a degree, because we don't have power and we're on the receiving end of the kicks and the punches. But that's just a means to an end. It's not like liberals where that is the end, because the classic liberal, is just a platform. It's just an abstract value, is an end to itself. But for what purpose? Why? Why have free speech? Why have individual rights? Well, we know why that is. So that you see the sort of the power elite, whoever they may be, they understand it as well. So when they were weaker, they embraced liberal values, and now that we are weaker, we're going to have to embrace them until we can discard them as well. But I've said it before, and it's the liberal in the middle, the classic liberal, is just like the fat kid and keeping the toilet seat warm for bigger boys, and he just gets sort of pushed off, and then somebody with superior will sit on it and take a dump.
Okay, so you've listened to that, and we're currently in this position, and it's easily observable from the past that at times prior to the current year, the left used freedom of speech to pursue their agenda. And as Morgoth points out, it is simply, in his case, in the case of people who think like him, a tool. Now again, I don't think everyone on the right, and especially the alt-right, because that's what we're talking about here, advocates for the curtailment of freedom of speech. But this is a current I've seen crop up very frequently in those circles, that freedom of speech at best is simply a tool, and after that you impose your will and restrictions as you see fit. And what I don't want to see in the future, and this is my personal interest, and I actually think it's in the interest of the species itself, or at least people who live in Western society, is an exchange of the soft tyranny of the left for a soft tyranny of the right, or indeed a hard tyranny of some sort, because it's very clear based on what this gentleman said and what we can see coming from the left that people of these extremes really view freedom of speech as a tool and a means to an end. And then afterwards, it becomes a matter of arbitrary whim as to which types of speech and which types of thoughts and expression they find permissible or acceptable. Now, this term subversion gets bandied about quite a bit in alt-right circles, but really what subversion means is just stuff that you don't like. And both the right and the left have their respective views on what they view as quote-unquote subversive, i.e. things they don't like. And it's just a matter of preference ultimately, with the right representing certain values and the left, in as much as these terms are useful, representing their values. But I really want to make the case for freedom of speech and freedom of expression here. And I also want to make the case for why we don't want either the current set of people in power, or in a more extreme form, to continue to be in power. And we also don't want people from Morgoth's camp in power either. And I'm not saying this is a classical liberal. It's kind of a meme to make fun of people who defend freedom of speech on principle as a classic liberal, but that's certainly not my camp. No, actually, I view freedom of speech from the perspective of pragmatism. You see, human beings have enormous deficits in the information they have access to and the knowledge they have access to. Now, if you imagine a world that places specific restrictions on what can be said or what should be said, then naturally the conclusion you can draw from that is that some information will be filtered out. And because we're not omniscient, and because we don't have access to all the information and knowledge in the universe and the world, we will miss out on things. And sometimes, admittedly, there is bad information. And sometimes knowledge is inaccurate. And sometimes our apprehension of these things is poor, and that's all true. So sometimes bad ideas essentially get put out there, and people latch onto bad ideas, and they achieve a misunderstanding, subsequently, of what is going on. And that's all well and good, and I concede that. The flip side of that, of course, again, is that there are many good ideas, potentially good ideas at least, and there's much knowledge to be had and acquired and many things to be understood and information can be spread that is positive and beneficial that potentially runs the risk of being suppressed because of, we'll say, well-intentioned people who wish to push their ideological agenda one way or another, be it right or left, and we will miss out on that. And this is why I defend freedom of speech as a fairly absolute principle, barring some examples. I think the classic example is yelling fire in a theater because it puts people in danger. And I suppose you could monkey branch off of that argument to all kinds of social arguments, but I don't really think they hold water. It's very clear to me, and I think it should be clear to most people, that the reason why we've been able to make so much progress is because of the free exchange of ideas. And there's some people that sort of put that out there as almost a mantra, and there's almost a clichédness to it. I'm not a fan of that. But the reality is, if you look at the past, there are many people that wanted to talk about things, scientific, political, or otherwise, that didn't have that option and face certain penalties in doing so. And so essentially what I'm arguing for is maintaining open pathways and open channels for the free exchange of information and knowledge, because that, in my humble opinion, would be most beneficial to just about everybody. Now, what happens when people seize hold of power? And let's be honest, both the left and the right in this case view the world only in terms of power. Their principles might exist, but power is inextricably linked to it. Of course, power is an element. I'm not denying that. Power is an obvious factor in everything, particularly in politics, but there are also principles that are simply useful that supersede and transcend notions of power. And so I worry in cases like this that if things were to shift too far to the right, we would just end up in a reverse situation where things that the right didn't like were frowned upon, where people's livelihoods would be put in jeopardy, where things that they didn't want to hear wouldn't be said, even if they were true and verifiably so, etc., etc. So let's take a page out of the book of one of the current controversies that the left disapproves of, and that is discussion of actual human biodiversity. Okay, the right is nominally for that type of discussion, but only for the things they approve of. Dissent is punished. We saw this with what happened to alternative hypothesis. Say what you want of him, but that was a form of dissent. It was punished. And I would worry about, for example, in a world controlled by the likes of a Morgoth, that the actual truth, the accuracy of information, if it did not align with the political ideology that he represents, would be suppressed and denied. And anytime accurate and useful information is suppressed, we tend to lose out. And so what we're losing out on now in the current climate, with the left being the people holding on to the reins of power, is an honest discussion about the consequences of human biodiversity. Even a concept as rudimentary as intelligence is denied outright. The idea that it even exists and that it differs between individuals and that these differences can lead to huge differences in outcome and degrees of success in life, etc., etc. That's a huge issue. Personally, my view is that this intelligence discussion is probably the most important discussion we can have. That's a discussion for another time. I've made mention of it many times on my channel. But if things were to shift too far to the right, we might need to worry about other things. Maybe they're related, maybe they're not. And this is why I do not align myself with the left or the right, why I vehemently deny any affiliation with either, because ultimately, if your only goal is the attainment of power so you can exercise your will, and you don't care about truth, and by truth I mean accurate representation of information and facts, not some obscure Petersonian notion that is inspired by Christianity or Judeo-Christianity or the Bible, then it's very difficult to find any common ground with either of these people. There are times when I find myself in agreement with the right. Much more rarely, although it does happen, I find myself in agreement with the left. But the fact that there are members of both the left and the right that find free speech to be only a useful tool until they achieve power is very emblematic of the necessity of hitting the brakes when we reach an appropriate moment of equilibrium. Personally, I want the left and right to be at each other's throats for perpetuity. I want neither to gain ascendancy, and this way we can maintain the free flow of information. Think about the time you spent on YouTube and all the things you've learned. Well, think about, in addition to that, on any arbitrary basis, if a particular set of information or branch of knowledge you found interesting, useful, or insightful were denied to you. So on the one hand, it prevents you from learning, but who knows what its application might be to the greater society in the world. And none of this has to do with classical liberalism or some sort of abstract philosophical principle. It just has to do with a type of ruthless pragmatism. We need the free flow of information. We need to be able to discuss ideas and their validity. And it might be that some people don't care about that, and they only care about their ideology, such as people on the left and people who represent at least the faction of the right that would affiliate with Morgoth. And again, I have nothing against him as a person, but his vision of the world is not a vision that I share, just as the current vision the people on the left have is not a vision I share. And we need to be vigilant on more than one front. The first and obvious front is maintaining vigilance and resistance towards the current political regime, if you want to call it that, the political majority, the people who wield power, but also vigilance towards the types of ideas represented in that clip. I do not think the world would be a better place if we were to usher in some new fascistic era where whatever arbitrary preferences people like that have are given favor and other ideas are suppressed, because history itself attests to the importance of the free flow of information. Now, I'm not trying to convince anyone with my arguments, I'm simply trying to put my viewpoint out there, but I think each and every one of us, whatever our particular political allegiance or feelings of political alliance, knows that we've benefited from access to information that in some cases other people would have deemed to be forbidden fruit or subversive, as the alt-right likes to call it. And that's something I think that we can all acknowledge. And unfortunately, the world is not black and white. And the idea that there must be a sales pitch made to the masses, be it from the left or right, that the world is black and white is silly. Sure, there are many people out there that, frankly speaking, lack the cognitive capacity to understand nuance and complex issues. But there are also people who can. And cutting off the free flow of information denies the people that can the ability to learn new things and apply them to the world. And who knows what might come of that. This has always been the way of the world. Even when the information was not in free flux, it still was a benefit that information was put out there, however it got out there. And so again, I would say that the hill I die on is the hill of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, precisely because it's necessary for the spread and processing of information that otherwise would not be available if certain people hold the reins of power. Anyway, I don't want to say much more about this. Again, not an abstract principle. It's just a pragmatic principle. I think it's a pragmatic principle that ultimately is more beneficial than it is negative. I will likely check you out at a later date, assuming I'm still alive. Until then, you take care, and bye-bye.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.